Welcome, everyone, to the BlueDrop podcast, where we talk about the Blue Fly Collective perspective on Drupal and our community. Today, I will be hosting the program alone because my guest is the person who is usually my co-host, Chad Hester. Welcome, Chad.
Thanks, Rose, for hosting today so we can talk about one of my favorite topics, Canadian digital sovereignty and the Canada First Digital Solutions Initiative.
Before we start, I'm Rose Cameron, global brand strategist, cultural anthropologist with 30 years of experience working in high tech. I've been involved with the launches of little known languages such as C, C++, Visual Basic, Linux, Rational Rose, Java, and Azure. Friend and confidant to the developer community. And you, Chad?
So I'm Chad Hester, an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect with a 25-year background in web strategy, design, user experience, and development. I've been working heavily with Drupal in this community for over 16 years.
And we appreciate it. So before we dive right into Canadian data sovereignty, which is going to be our topic today, you're not originally from Canada, are you, Chad?
No. So I was born in Virginia, grew up around a very large family within NASA and the government in general. So got a lot of exposure to that. Then I moved to Baltimore in my teens. I didn't move to Canada until 2022 when I had a wonderful opportunity. My wife and I moved to British Columbia and moved around a little bit trying to figure out where we wanted to live. We weren't even sure if we were going to stay in British Columbia, but wanted to give it a shot. It's very expensive here, but also extraordinarily beautiful.
Oh, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, Chad.
I can't help it. I can't get away from it. So that's one of the main reasons I'm here. I won't lie. I also really appreciate things like universal health care and things of that nature. You know, I'm not getting younger and my health will not get better as I get older, I'm sure. So that's an important thing for me.
So you talk, and we've talked a great deal about data sovereignty, and I know you're really, really passionate about it. Why is data sovereignty so important, and why specifically now?
Yeah, so I think it's a subject that's not only come up recently, but is something that from a national level has become a growing sensitivity. When computing systems first came out, I don't want to say that there was a lack of sensitivity, but I think there was an ambition and an optimism for not only a lot of computing products, software that you install on your computer, or the services as the internet kind of came on. Who wouldn't want to install Dropbox? Who wouldn't want to use Google Workspace and these sort of things? AI comes along, and that adds yet another layer of sensitivity to security, privacy, those sort of things. But as we're taking a look at the changing geopolitical landscape, whether it's a private business or a government entity, the concern is still the same. So I know that many of us have worked with or have friends or family who have worked in cybersecurity. Some folks may not know too much about how that works, but know that is an important factor. But from a Canadian standpoint, and you can kind of project this to literally any country, cybersecurity is really important to make sure that the data, whether it's data about citizens or data about businesses or data about government entities, is protected. If that can be exploited, then Canada or another country could be vulnerable. So I do want to be sensitive to the role that it plays in Canadian defense. And of course, the other aspect that I think is really important is, as a country, Canada relies still today a lot on the United States for various services, goods, so much. And Canada is being a little bit sensitive to that. You take a look at, for example, the automotive industry, you take a look at a lot of other industries, and that's been largely disrupted. We're taking a look at trade with other countries as a way to kind of counterbalance that. But I think it's also important to look domestically. So the Canadian economy, I think, has to be considered in terms of supporting Canadian businesses. So if I'm a small to medium sized business, of course, I want to thrive. But even large scale businesses that need to provide enterprise solutions to other Canadian businesses and even internationally, I think there's a large opportunity to give Canadians more jobs and to better utilize things that can pull money into the growth of this country. So,
Now,
yeah, go ahead.
um, you also, I mean, when we've talked a little bit about, the kind of American monopolies around,
Yeah,
if you think about where does innovation come from?
yes. So I think for the longest time, the United, being a U.S. citizen, and having lived most of my life there, I was very familiar with things like monopoly and antitrust laws existing, and for the most part, also some large tech companies kind of circumventing that. And I remember when I think it was Bell got broken up
Yeah.
quite a bit, and this was decades ago, and I was a kid still when that was kind of in the limelight. And then I'm taking a look at companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, uh, taking the lion's share of certain technical solutions, and that actually stifles innovation and it changes the way that pricing works. If you're the behemoth in the room and somebody wants to buy something that that solution provides, you're really the only kid on the block, and you can kind of set the tone and set the prices, and it also stifles that innovation. So by introducing greater competition in the market, I think that it adds a little competitiveness. It adds a little bit of pressure to have more fair pricing. And I think Canada has an opportunity now to step into that. And arguably, any country does. But I have to speak a little bit from the perspective of where I currently live and trying to encourage the economy that I thrive with to kind of bolster itself and help the businesses that exist here and create jobs.
You
So,
know,
yeah,
speaking of jobs there in Canada, I mean, what are you seeing right now? Because
yeah,
in America, we're seeing a lot of this discussion, debate, acrimony with regards people coming into the country.
yeah,
Obviously there are a bunch of kind of marshmallow people from Canada who would be welcomed, but there are others maybe not so much.
yeah.
What is your sense of the kind of climate there with regards jobs and economy?
Yeah, so Canada's interesting if you compare it to some countries. Let's speak from kind of maybe an unexpected perspective. The birth rate in Canada actually dictates a lot of times that we have to look outside of Canada to consider hiring.
Mhm.
There's immigration laws here in Canada that change a little bit in terms of what jobs we're looking for. So, for example, if you're a doctor and you're outside of Canada, we want you because we need doctors, and that will ebb and flow in terms of what sort of job roles are needed, and we'll kind of target that. So because our population, we have a population of just over, I think, 40 million. Because our population, one of the most well educated in the world,
Yes.
still isn't capable of always satisfying the needs in certain job sectors, we do look outside of Canada. And again, other countries do the same sort of thing in some cases. And we'll typically have programs which will encourage not just work permits, but permanent residency and even Canadian citizenship. Some countries allow for dual citizenship. The US and Canada is currently one of those situations. So it's something that I think is worth consideration. That's part of how we got here. You're required by law to first try to hire a Canadian for that role. So it's not like you're just ignoring that and just hiring from outside of the country. So that's one of the practices that I think is really important. Uh, the other is, you have growing industries. And let's take AI. It's this constant elephant in the room. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a fact that it is a growing area of the tech industry, which means not only are you doing generative AI stuff, which again is the hot topic, I think, but you're doing a lot other things in terms of scientific research, defense, where AI is still playing a big role. And that also means data centers. So you need to hire people who are very familiar with how to set up data centers and maintain them and make sure that they're in the right locations to be economically viable. So can you tap into geothermal? Can you tap into wind? Can you tap into solar? That sort of thing. Of course, there's security. So to digress, I think there are a lot of jobs that Canadian foreign policy and domestic policy are currently looking at. Mark Carney has been very aggressive in terms of what it is that he wants to do, both domestically and internationally. I think AI is one of those things that's on the list, along with data centers that aren't in the United States or elsewhere. So there's a bit of that data sovereignty sensitivity. If Canadians are going to be uploading their personal information and it crosses international borders, then that's, I think, a bit of that risk and that concern. But this extends well past those sort of use cases.
How sensitive do you think
Yeah.
Canadians are to that?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to someone in the Canadian military or the Canadian government, I would say very sensitive. If you're talking to someone who is an executive in a large organization, very sensitive. If you're talking about a retiree who's mostly on Facebook and things like that, well, you could take it or leave it. They may or may not have a high sensitivity to it because they may not understand it. But I think that's where we, as people who do work in tech, have a responsibility to talk to people who we, interact with about the importance of data sovereignty, what that means to them as citizens or residents of a country. And privacy is one of the first places to start. You don't want people stealing your identity. You don't want people using that information for other nefarious purposes. And you certainly don't want foreign nations trying to use that to manipulate, for example, an upcoming vote in an election, which we've seen a lot of in the past decade. So that's not so much to say, hey, let's go put on our tinfoil hats and go conspiracy nuts. These are proven things that have occurred in our modern technological society, and I think there's a viable national security risk in terms of how data is used. There are a lot of
You
very
know,
smart people working on it too.
yeah. Well, and you bring that up, and as you're talking, I'm thinking very much of, the old system was if you're anywhere in the rest of the world and you're in tech,
Mhm.
there's this aspiration in some ways that you will either study or work at some point in time with an American firm,
Yeah,
preferably on American soil, um, connecting with, in real time, not virtual, other Americans,
yeah,
and that somehow is a gateway into greater things.
hmm
And as that door has slammed shut in the face of so many people, as you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, is this putting Canada at the forefront of a lot of these extremely talented immigrants' minds
yeah,
with regards, why would I even consider going to the United States where healthcare is a fortune, where real estate is a
yeah,
fortune, and where maybe I don't agree with some of the political aspects? What are your thoughts on that?
yeah. I mean, financial stability, health, and also just understanding. It's kind of like reading tea leaves. Sometimes we can we can have those fight or flight sort of triggers about our future. We can think about what we see in the news and get outraged as it's engineered to have us do. But I think having a calm, cool, collected head is really important. Um, I don't personally enjoy looking at the news as a source of truth. I rather see that as just what's going on in the world. First off, trying to be sensitive to your news consumption, especially news coming out of the United States, I think is a really important thing in terms of making decisions about your future and the future of your family. So I say that it's kind of like reading tea leaves because anybody that's trying to understand what is going to happen in, let's just say, the next 10 years from a global economy standpoint, you can speculate, but I always point at past disasters as a way of reading those sort of tea leaves. Whether it's a world war or a global economic crash like the Depression, that sort of thing, humans survived. It was very hard for a very large number of people. That very much could happen again in a more modern way. And I think that it's very important to take stock of what is most important for your survival first and the survival of your immediate family. So that means, do you have access to shelter? Do you have access to water? Do you have access to food? Do you have access to healthcare? If you start with those basic things and look just through that lens at what can you do in terms of finding a place to live, if you're currently looking, what do you need to do in terms of finding a place to work? Just through those perspectives, I think that it makes Canada really stand out in some regards because we do have good access to a lot of those things and access to those things in the United States. And this isn't just about mudslinging saying, haha, Canada is better than the US. If I'm just looking at those key factors, that's part of what motivated me to move to Canada, not from a political perspective, but from a survival perspective. If anything, I'm not getting younger. I am getting older. My health will deteriorate over time. And I like that idea of having access to healthcare and other benefits. There's, in Canada in particular, there's things like the nationwide pension plan. It's not much, but it is a factor. If I'm unemployed, my unemployment rights are much better. Minimum wages is much higher here than it is in the United States. So as we take a look at these key things for survival, whether it's Canada or other places, I can at least acknowledge that the way that Canada is behaving on the global stage emulates and reflects a lot of European countries that have done the same. So whether it's Canada or Denmark or name a place, right? This is, I think, something, if you are a professional who has an education and an experience that is valuable in the workforce, I think it's important to consider where is it that you want to live? Where can you live? Where do you qualify to live? And then kind of narrow down what actually makes sense for you, whether that's Canada or otherwise.
Because not everyone can fit in Ireland, you know.
No, no, no.
Now, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, if I look at these drives for data sovereignty and the demand that it generates for qualified individuals to staff this, what are, if any, the transformational solutions that Canada is exploring right now? I mean, here in the United
Yeah.
States, you see these massive data farms erupting everywhere, really hiking up the cost of electricity and that sort
Yeah.
of thing.
And water.
What is happening there in Canada?
Yeah, I think we're kind of at the early stages of investigating what that looks like. And you talk, you mentioned a kind of a word that I think is also important is transformation. If I'm looking at this from, let's just say, a business standpoint, all businesses have some fundamental functions in terms of how they need to manage their money flow, their personnel, and things like that. And there are a lot of digital solutions that really help those efforts. In this tech world, we refer to that as digital transformation. Now, maybe there's some solutions that have been helping you up to this date, But I always like to, but because I was a contractor for many years, and this is one of my job functions, is helping small to medium sized businesses with digital transformation. It's the evaluation of what are your business's needs, what are your income sources, what are your expenses, what is the current state of your technology, where does it help you, and where is it not really pulling its weight? And kind of looking at that through that lens. I have a small business, just a friend that I'm about to literally do this with, just as a courtesy, as a friendly sort of thing. And I'm like, if anything costs money, I'll let you know. But I first focus on, I don't want your income to drop. I want it to go up. I don't want your expenses to go up. I prefer that they go down. And I want to make sure that the digital solutions, even if it's something that you're already using or something that you should consider as a whole, are serving your business. So I think as we take a look at what you're talking about in data centers for Canada, I like to make sure that the utility of what those things are doing to serve a business and a population and a nation are worthwhile. And I think that we have a responsibility as people to make sure that we're not only utilizing electricity and water and also not putting out pollution in an irresponsible way, but also making sure that we're not just, hey, let's just make five more cat videos just because that's what I need to be whole as a person. It's not. We need to, if anything, step away from the computer when it's at that point. The data centers that Canada are taking a look at, from my understanding, from my very pedestrian perspective, have an advantage over a lot of data centers that would be placed in various locations in the United States in regards to we have access to a lot of water, we have a lot access to a lot of very clean energy, and because of that clean energy, we don't have the sort of issues with pollution that a lot of data centers like. For me, like I know somebody has a smart answer to this, but I can't reconcile in my head why somebody would put a data center in the middle of Texas, for example, where cooling costs would just be through the roof, and they also have a lot of electrical grid issues, especially when you have cold snaps or
Yep.
hurricanes or name a thing. And I'm not saying that putting a data center in Canada, especially when you have 40 degrees below, is necessarily easy either, because then you switch it to heating costs. Um, but I think that Canada, like a lot of other nations who are very energy sensitive and water sensitive, have a lot of that in mind, and they aren't so beholden to corporate interests alone. There's a lot of regulation that kind of counterbalances a lot of those special interests.
So we saw here, as recent as a year ago, a great many people, come into the data centers of the US government who had no security clearances, and people kind of opened the door to them and said, please, play in amidst our data, um, which was deeply disturbing for
Yeah.
many. When you look at the risks of foreign data management, what are kind of your top three or four aspects of the watchouts and the reasons why you really should consider data sovereignty?
Right, right. So I think if my data is managed through one of the many services that many businesses and municipal entities rely on, that crosses so many different boundaries. Um, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, HubSpot, I mean, a lot of these things we have become so conditioned to rely on that we don't really even think of alternatives. And it's not so much the monopoly alone that's the concern. I mean, that is certainly a concern that people have become so conditioned that they rely on that as the main solution, and there's not much competition. But it's how cavalier we are sometimes as people, and that leaches into business practices to just freely give our data. How many times have we so quickly hit the I agree button without reading the legal information. And it's designed in such a way that you want the outcome without considering the consequences. So I think from my perspective, the biggest factor in both personal and corporate responsibility that we really need to start to shift. That first comes with education, and then second with safe practice. It's like when safe sex was something that had to be taught and had to really be campaigned against, and that campaign never stopped. So similar to that, we need to have safe data practices. Now, our industry has many regulations and standards and practices, but it's mostly highly technical people who are aware of those things and have to adhere to them. So in the United States, you have HIPAA, and you also have like the CCPA in California to help protect privacy. And some of those laws were gaining some traction in trying to protect people who, again, like safe sex, just didn't know any better. But this was at least a protection mechanism that would help them and hold organizations accountable. Whether it's privacy or I think another thing that was under fire and still is a bit under fire, especially in the United States, is encryption. Encryption is essential if you're going to do anything with data, whether it's banking or military or even just a private conversation that you want to have and you know is truly private and protected. So I think growing some personal awareness is really important, but also having safeguards and mechanisms built into policy is even more paramount.
One thing that's really concerning to me, and I ran into this very recently. I was doing some work with a gambling site, and this is a
Popping up
great
everywhere.
yeah. This is a great case of, is government protecting me or exposing me, right?
Yeah.
So I was working with them, and they were like, okay, and now in the authentication, and this is specific to Pennsylvania, we ask for their social insurance number.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no, 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 no. I've been taught my entire life, you don't even give that to your mother.
Yeah.
You give that to no one. You don't laminate the card even. I mean, it's that precious. And they were like, no, 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 this is going to protect people against identity theft and all the rest of it. I'm like, you know, and maybe it's just I can see generations that are younger than me going, here, have it. What the hell? It'll get me onto the gambling floor. But
Yeah.
I was immediately like, no. And I mean, this in my mind is a new rule.
Yeah.
And it's being enforced by the Pennsylvania government. And I love Josh Shapiro. Don't, don't get me wrong here. But that kind of, are we teaching people through some of these new protocols to relax?
Yeah. And the relax is slow. It's little baby steps. It's chipping away at the wall. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you take a look at gambling sites and apps, flashback 10 years ago, a lot of these didn't exist.
No.
They've slowly eroded, and I could probably have an entire discussion about capitalism and how that has basically become one of the most toxic elements in the United States, and then by proxy, the rest of the world.
No.
I think that's what gives rise to those things. Is again, just like that terms of service agreement that people just click I agree without really thinking of the consequences. How much of your information are you giving away that you really should protect a little bit more? And how do you know that these people are credible? How do you know that they have your interests in mind? You have to assume by default that another party does not have your interest in mind, no matter what they say, no matter how
Yeah,
beautiful their marketing is.
I agree, and I am I the only one who remembers Las Vegas was started by the mafia? You know?
In some respects.
And now we're saying give them your social insurance number.
Yeah.
It's anathema to me. So anyhow, when you think about these scores of companies that, I mean, and a lot of the early adopters have already built their infrastructures. They've already got, say, their data on some mammoth American uh, hosting site. Is this data sovereignty? How difficult is that for them? I mean, are
Mhm.
they the people we're talking about, or are we talking about new entrants, or what are your thoughts on that? Because it
Yeah.
looks like a Leviathan task to transport. I would think that there would be more of a threat transporting data
Mhm.
than, just letting the chips lie where they may.
Yeah, and I think this comes to the damage is already done. The calls coming from within the house. I think I divided up digital transformation targets. This initiative that I kind of framed out that I wanted to talk to some of our MPs and MLAs and just try to get some traction on this. It's not about, hey, this is the way and Chad has the great idea. Why don't you inflate his ego a little bit more? This is more a matter of I'm worried about the health and the safety of Canadians because I'm now one, among them, but also from a financial standpoint, supporting those businesses in their transition to something that's safer and more healthy. So I thought about it for a while. I'm like, how can the Canadian government subsidize the cost for this if we're able to pull taxpayer money into this? Because that comes saddled with its own responsibilities. You have to account for that. What's the value proposition there? So from my position, as someone who has done a lot of user experience work, marketing work, that sort of thing, I thought about it a little bit. I'm like, what's going to cost least and the most approachable thing versus the more challenging thing? And you're touching on it a little bit here with the idea of, a lot of these organizations are already using these systems. So I actually divided up into three major categories. One is you have an organization that does not have a technical solution for something, and now they're in the market for it. Maybe it's a CRM, or maybe it's a point of sale system, or name a thing, right? Where data flows. Maybe they're a new business, or maybe they're a business that have been doing things with paper, and now they're trying to go through a digital transformation to save money, to make things more efficient and effective. They're the easiest audience for that sort of subsidy, because if we want to encourage them to use something that is safe data, sort of like safe sex, safe data, then we need to encourage them to go towards things that are hosted domestically where possible, supporting Canadian jobs, that sort of thing. And sometimes those solutions may cost a little bit more than a foreign solution, or it may be less popular. And so we need, whenever we do digital transformations, we factor in costs and features and how it works in concert with your other digital solutions. So all of that is a factor. So to encourage a business to buy a Canadian solution means that, if anything, you have to attack the most obvious thing, which is cost. You also want to encourage businesses. If I'm going to create, say, a Dropbox alternative, and there are Canadian Dropbox alternatives, it not only has to be more affordable, but it also has to have as many features, if not more features. And that's really hard for a software company to achieve. So those sort of subsidies also have to go towards the companies producing these digital solutions. The first audience is someone who doesn't already have a digital solution. The second is they do have a digital solution, but maybe it's really old. Maybe they were already kind of in the market for replacing it. So whenever you replace a digital solution, a lot of times you have to focus on two enormous costs: migration, which is migrating your data from one solution to another, and training. Your staff needs to know how to use this stuff. The third is the most hard. It's where those digital solutions are so ingrained, they're so entrenched within the business that the business is looking at an absolutely enormous cost to try to replace that solution, to the point where they're going to fight you in even considering that. They're the hardest audience, and they're probably the least likely that you are going to convince to touch, even with financial subsidies from the government. But I think if you first tackle the first two easier audiences, it makes it more attractive. You're moving the needle a little bit for the most difficult case to eventually take a look at adoption of things that do promote good digital sovereignty.
I think of all of those cases where people say, you know, X really large software company or hosting company, this is the number of times that it is attacked
Yeah,
on a yearly basis. And there seems to be a direct correlation between fame and attack, right? It's
yeah,
like those people who go up to prize fighters who have all of these awards and they say, I'll fight you,
yeah.
because it's a challenge, right, to break into that. Do you have any sense of whether Canada has less or more attacks than the United States? I know it's a crazy out there question.
No, no, no. I'm just trying to think about that a little bit. I I, th- I think surprisingly, the current administration here in Canada is being very aggressive because we talk about force functions. How, like, for example, when the pandemic came along, a lot of companies had to really consider working remotely. Now we have the whole like return to office garbage, but that was a force function to demonstrate that remote work is very possible and can be healthy, and can sustain an economy within a certain extent. So I think in the same manner, right now, the Canadian government's hand is being forced. You know, we could be under threat of tariffs every single day, and then those tariffs could suddenly just be renegotiated because we're sitting here talking about trade deals with China, and then suddenly the U.S. does exactly the same thing. So it's a head scratcher. So at the end of the day, I think it's um, the rest of the school knows who the school bully is, and we've banded together to say, you know what? They can say or do whatever they're going to do. We have no control over that. What we have control over is our own actions. So I think in that regard, we steel ourselves up. We start talking to, the other kids in the playground who aren't bullying us, and we form alliances. We say, I have access to these wonderful baked goods that my mom gives me at lunch. I have more than enough, and I'm going to bring those in because you always have these Tootsie Pops that I really love, and we'll have some fun train there. And I think Canada right now is looking at not only foreign policy but also domestic policy to kind of steel ourselves up to figure out what's the healthy existence that we can muster.
So, what I'm getting a sense from you is that Canada at this point in time in its life is open to transformation because
Have to be.
of the contextual environment you're living within.
Yeah.
What are the challenges to change?
Right.
What is holding back specific movement, specifically in the arena of digital transformation?
Yeah. I think I can take a look at that from two directions. First is you have a lot of infrastructure that has existed and took a lot of time to build. Let's first take a look at of all things. Everybody has car analogies, and I'm one of them. But the automotive industry is one of those really good analogies between the U.S. and Canada, because when you develop manufacturing and production and just an industry that relies on international distribution of a lot of those things. In some cases, you have the talent in Canada. In some cases, you have the talent in the United States, and it doesn't just immediately go to the other side where it's needed. That takes a lot of times. You also have facilities that utilize that talent. Maybe it's automotive parts. Maybe it's people who can simply do repair of certain types. Maybe it's the materials themselves come from a certain place and need to be processed or refined. Point being is you don't replace those facilities overnight. It can take a decade if you're aggressive to replace those sort of things. And in the technology industry, it's very similar. A lot of the digital services that we currently utilize here in Canada, and this, again, I keep saying this, is the same thing around the world. How many organizations are reliant on Google, Microsoft, Amazon, you name the thing? They are reliant on those organizations, and you can't just immediately replace those. It is such an enormous cost that even if you had the money, let's say, poof, the money's there, it still takes time to transition over to something that is equally viable as what you currently have, even if you have some sort of a loss of functionality, which in of itself is its own cost and penalty, um, which we're seeing. We're seeing that, like in the automotive industry right now, we're trying to make deals with South Korea or Germany or name a thing, but those are not going to be industries that are equivalent to what we had in the past few decades with the United States. It's just not. And the same is very true of the digital solutions side of things.
And they're going in different directions. So, for example, I was doing some work on, where India is seeing growth, and they're talking
Yeah.
about hydrogen-powered cars, right?
Mhm.
Which is a massive right-hand turn versus what we've traditionally seen.
Mhm.
Um, is Canada suited to those types of shifts that completely break the existing model and supplant it with something else that, quite frankly, may completely reinvent the supply chain wheel, as it were?
Yeah. I think we have to be. And again, a lot of the perspective I'm saying is Canadian because of how close we are to the United States, but this extrapolates to literally any country. I think there's just become a sudden, again, the force function sensitivity worldwide, but especially in Canada, because of our proximity to a changing relationship, where you have to ask yourself that question. If all of a sudden the things that we rely on just poof disappeared, where are we? What can we do? Do we have a total collapse? And as a society, we have to step up and say, well, let's start working on those things right now, because you can't just sit there on your hands and do nothing or hope that it doesn't happen. You have to have a plan. And that's what we're actively seeing right now.
So actively seen.
Yes.
Talk to me in our last couple of minutes here
Mhm.
about what you're personally doing to initiate this. What are
Mhm.
you doing to make sure that Canada is safe and secure with data sovereignty?
Yeah, and I thankfully I'm not alone in this. I like to be an outspoken voice for something that impacts my livelihood and impacts the technical community that I'm in, and the safety of businesses that I not only can serve, but at arm's length can at least advise. Um, when I thought about where I chose to live, I moved here to Canada. I look back at when I did live in Baltimore. I was uh, aware, vocal, and plugged into my local political community. I always tell people, don't worry about global or national politics. That's something that you can barely scratch. You, as a single person, even as like a community, you're not going to have a major shift or impact on things. I'm not saying don't try, do try. I support personally. I don't mind airing my laundry publicly. I personally support things like pro-choice. And I will be vocal about those things because I think that it's an important thing to be vocal about the things that you believe in. And I'm not using this as a platform for that. I'm simply saying that as an example of something that, you know, each of us as individuals, we shouldn't hide those things just because we work at a place or just because we play with a sport team or something like that. But also feel at the same time, the place where you have the greatest impact is always local. So if you're in a city or a community, even a small town, uh, if you're religious, join a church. If you're not religious, find other community programs where you can get involved and say, hey, what are the needs of my community? Me personally, I joined a chamber of commerce here locally. That got me plugged into local businesses and local politicians and elected officials. And I think that let me better empathize with what not only are my needs, but as a contractor at the time, what can I do to serve? Where is that need growing, and how is that changing over the course of time? And how can I apply my own not just beliefs, but my own skills in those areas? So I came up with the Canada First Digital Solutions Initiative. Rolls right off the tongue. But this is a way of me just simply organizing my thoughts. It's not about saying, hey, everybody should adopt this and it should be named this, and hey, Chad has an ego. It was never about that. It was simply a way of me trying to communicate with other people what I thought was important and what could help them. So I focused first on, can we get some government support for Canadian businesses who provide solutions? Let's just kind of start from that lens, and then matchmake with businesses who need those solutions. Maybe they don't have a solution. You know, the first audience that we mentioned earlier, they don't have a solution. So let's meet them where their needs are with a Canadian solution. So one example that I give, and this is not a promo, is a lot of people use Dropbox. It's a familiar file storage and sharing sort of solution. You may consider something more exotic like S3 for your storage needs if you're an enterprise, but sync.com is a Canadian solution. It's on Canadian soil. You can use that, and that's a solution that serves small to medium-sized businesses completely adequately. And I took a look at other similar things. You know, we work in open source, and Bluefly supports Drupal and other open source solutions. And that was one of the things that I put in the initiative as well, that I think, you know, let's also promote Bluefly, which while they are a US based company, can serve an audience literally anywhere. There's nothing to say that Bluefly cannot serve a Canadian audience and help support Canadian digital solutions and data sovereignty. With that said, if there's not a Canadian solution, you can at least take a look at an open source solution that can be hosted in a Canadian data center. That's a wonderful way of approaching those things. And again, you can subsidize those costs. So as I was taking a look a lot at, you know, the growing, changing economic and political landscape here in Canada, I started to talk to folks at the Chamber of Commerce and also my local elected officials to say, hey, I'm but one person. How can I kind of channel this this pressure that I'm seeing happen into a positive way that we can impact first our local community? You know, I can apply my contractor abilities and help local businesses or whatnot. But how can you take this to Ottawa and help let it flourish among other folks? And so I drafted this thing. I shared it with a few businesses and those elected officials, and it started to get some traction. Traction in the sense of an idea, not in the sense of people are flourishing to my document that I put together and saying, hey, here's the way. And the beautiful thing that I'm observing as just a resident here in Canada is I take a look at what Mark Carney's policy. Anybody that doesn't know his background, he has a very heavy economic background, which I think right now, given what's happening, is a good sensitivity to have as our prime minister. but you take a look at some of his recent policy changes. He is really not only focused on changes that impact digital solutions in Canada, but across the board, things that will really help Canadian businesses and the Canadian population.
Go, Mark.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so I just wanted to, make people aware as well that, they can explore this with you more, that you're
Mhm.
open to that. How should they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to read about what I put together, it's just a 3-page document. We'll put it in the show notes and link to that. Definitely take a look at that because maybe it will spark some ideas, not only for what you can do for us Canadians, but what you can do in your own community. Always think about that. But you can find me on LinkedIn. My username there is Chad K. Hester. So if you can find that, or just find me on LinkedIn, just with my name, Chad Hester. That I think would be the best way to get in touch with me. Or obviously go through Bluefly, and I'm sure they can connect you to me. But Bluefly is also a wonderful community of people, very talented developers, designers, project managers who can also help you understand what your options are as an organization, whether you're in the US or not, to really be hypersensitive to your data sovereignty.
hmm And I know that we're going to have Johan on the show for our next episode talking
Yeah,
about that because for those maybe who haven't seen it, Dries came out with an article
yeah,
for Drupal and the importance of open source and data sovereignty,
mhm,
and just the overall importance of data sovereignty first and foremost. So, if any of you have not seen that, we'll also put a link on the site so that you can read Dries's article, which is very thoughtful in nature. It's not, typical of Dries.
yeah,
Anyhow, um, I wanted to thank you, Chad, so much
yeah. Thank you.
because there are very few people who give of themselves as much as you do to this community and to the world at large. Thank you so much for enlightening to us today and to our listeners. Thanks for joining us on the BlueDrop podcast. We enjoyed having you with us. And if you'd like to learn more about Bluefly and our team, please visit our website at bluefly.io. This is Rose Cameron,
Chad Hester.
and we thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you.